When my grandfather passed, my family was stunned to learn he left his entire $2.3 million estate to me. My mom screamed, "That was meant for your sister." That night, they held me down and shredded the will in front of me. Now they regret what they did. I, 24M, never expected my grandfather's funeral to turn into the most devastating betrayal of my life. But I should have seen it coming when the lawyer cleared his throat and announced I was inheriting everything. The reading happened 3 days after we buried Grandpa Joe. I sat in that sterile law office watching my family's faces transform from grief to shock to pure rage as the lawyer explained the $2.3 million estate was mine. Mom's face went white, then red. Dad gripped his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. My sister Sarah just stared at me like I'd murdered someone. Mom exploded first. She screamed that the money was meant for Sarah, that there had been a mistake, that I'd somehow manipulated a dying old man. The lawyer calmly explained the will was ironclad, signed and witnessed properly just 6 months ago. Sarah started crying, asking why Grandpa would do this to her when she was the one who visited him every week, brought him groceries, took him to doctor appointments. I tried explaining that I'd been helping Grandpa with his finances for 2 years, that we'd grown close after I started my accounting degree, but nobody wanted to hear it. They demanded I share the inheritance equally. When I said I needed time to think, Mom's expression turned cold in a way I'd never seen before. That night, they invited me over for dinner. I should have known something was wrong when Dad answered the door with that fake smile he used when he was planning something. Sarah was there too, along with my Uncle Mike and Aunt Linda. They said they wanted to discuss the inheritance like a family. After dinner, when I got up to leave, everything changed. Dad blocked the front door while Uncle Mike grabbed my arms from behind. I asked what they were doing, struggling to break free, but Mike was twice my size. Mom appeared with the will I'd stupidly brought to show them. Her eyes filled with something I'd never seen before, pure hatred. She told me they'd decided as a family that Sarah deserved the money more than I did. Sarah needed it for her medical school loans and her wedding next year. I was young and could make my own way. Mom said Grandpa had obviously been confused in his final months and hadn't meant to hurt Sarah like this. I fought harder, telling them this was insane, that they couldn't just steal my inheritance. Dad helped Mike hold me down on the living room floor while Sarah stood there crying, but not stopping them. Aunt Linda held my legs when I tried to kick free. Mom sat down in front of me with the will and slowly began tearing it into pieces. She told me I had a choice. I could either agree to split the money equally with Sarah, or I could watch my inheritance disappear forever. The lawyer had mentioned this was Grandpa's only copy since he'd been paranoid about banks and safety deposit boxes. I begged them to stop, promising we could work something out, but Mom just kept tearing. She said I'd always been selfish, that I'd somehow tricked Grandpa into changing his will behind everyone's backs. She scattered the pieces across the coffee table like confetti while I watched my future crumble. When they finally let me go, I was shaking with rage and disbelief. Dad warned me not to cause trouble over this. That family was more important than money. Sarah wouldn't even look at me as I stumbled toward the door. Mom called after me, saying I could still have half if I agreed to their terms by tomorrow. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. They thought they'd won. That destroying the will meant the money would go to Sarah as Grandpa's next closest relative. What they didn't know was that I'd learned a lot about estate planning during my internship at an accounting firm last summer. The next morning, I called the lawyer and explained what happened. He was horrified but not surprised. Family inheritance disputes brought out the worst in people. Then I told him about the backup plan Grandpa and I had discussed months earlier. See, Grandpa had been worried about exactly this scenario. He knew the family expected Sarah to inherit everything since she was the golden child who could do no wrong. That's why we'd set up a backup system that my family knew nothing about. 3 weeks before his death, Grandpa had transferred the majority of his assets into a revocable living trust with me as the sole beneficiary. The will they destroyed only covered about $50,000 in personal items and his checking account. The real estate, investments, and savings, the bulk of his $2.3 million estate, had already been legally transferred to me through the trust. When I called Mom to tell her, she didn't believe me at first. She insisted I was lying, that I was just trying to scam Sarah out of her rightful inheritance. I calmly explained that she could verify everything with the lawyer, that the trust documents were filed with the county and completely legal. The silence on the phone lasted almost a full minute. Then Mom started screaming again, but this time it was different, desperate instead of angry. She begged me to reconsider, saying they'd made a mistake, that emotions had been running high after the funeral. She promised they could work something out if I'd just be reasonable. I told her the same thing she'd told me, that I had a choice to make. I could either press charges for assault, theft, and destruction of property, or I could cut ties with all of them permanently, and they could pretend I didn't exist. But there would be no sharing, no family meetings, and no second chances. Dad called an hour later, his voice shaking with rage. He threatened to contest the trust, to hire lawyers, and tie up the estate for years. I reminded him that contesting a properly executed trust would cost tens of thousands in legal fees they didn't have, especially since Sarah was starting medical school in the fall. The lawyer had already assured me the trust was bulletproof. Update 1. The next few weeks were surreal. Sarah showed up at my apartment twice, crying and begging me to reconsider. She claimed she hadn't wanted to participate in destroying the will, that Mom and Dad had pressured her into staying quiet. She said she'd pay me back someday if I'd just help her with medical school. I listened to her sob story about how this would ruin her future, how she'd already been accepted to her dream program and couldn't afford it without Grandpa's money. When she finished, I asked her one simple question. Why didn't she stop them when they were holding me down? She couldn't answer. She just kept crying and saying she was sorry, that she'd been in shock, that everything happened so fast. I told her that her silence that night told me everything I needed to know about what kind of person she really was. The family tried different tactics over the next month. Aunt Linda called to tell me how disappointed Grandpa would be in my behavior. Uncle Mike showed up at my work, trying to intimidate me into changing my mind. Distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reached out with guilt trips about family loyalty and doing the right thing. The worst was when they tried using Grandma's memory against me. Mom called crying, saying Grandma would be rolling in her grave knowing I'd torn the family apart over money. She conveniently forgot that Grandma had always told me I was her favorite, that she'd worried about how Mom favored Sarah over me my entire childhood. I blocked their numbers, changed my apartment locks, and got a restraining order after Uncle Mike's workplace visit turned threatening. The lawyer advised me to document everything in case they escalated further. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own emotional aftermath. Losing my entire family overnight was devastating, even though I knew I'd made the right choice. Some nights I questioned whether the money was worth becoming completely alone in the world. Then I'd remember the look in Mom's eyes as she destroyed that will, and I knew there was no going back. Update 2. 6 months later, I found out through mutual friends that Sarah had to defer medical school for a year. She'd applied for every loan and scholarship available, but couldn't cover the full cost. Mom had taken out a second mortgage on their house trying to help, but it wasn't enough. Dad's small business was struggling because he'd been distracted by the family drama and legal consultations. I felt a momentary pang of guilt until I remembered them holding me down on that living room floor. They'd made their choice that night, and now they were living with the consequences. I used part of Grandpa's inheritance to finish my accounting degree debt-free and started my own practice. I also bought the small house next to where Grandpa used to live, partly as an investment, partly because it felt like keeping his memory close. The elderly neighbor mentioned that my family had been by several times, apparently hoping to find documents or assets they could claim. The real turning point came 8 months after the inheritance. I was having dinner at a restaurant downtown when I overheard familiar voices at a nearby table. It was Mom and Dad with some people I didn't recognize, apparently trying to borrow money from distant relatives. Dad was explaining how I'd stolen Sarah's inheritance through legal manipulation, how I'd taken advantage of a confused old man and destroyed the family. Mom chimed in about how they'd raised an ungrateful son who abandoned his sister in her time of need. They painted themselves as victims of my greed and manipulation. Listening to them rewrite history so completely was surreal. In their version, they were the innocent victims, and I was the villain who'd somehow conned Grandpa into leaving me everything. There was no mention of them destroying the will or holding me down against my will. That's when I realized they'd probably convinced themselves this narrative was true. They'd rather believe I was a master manipulator than admit they destroyed their relationship with their son over money that was never theirs to begin with. Update 3. A year after Grandpa's death, Sarah finally got into medical school through a delayed admission program and massive student loans. She sent me a graduation announcement and a letter saying she forgave me for everything that had happened, that she hoped we could rebuild our relationship now that she was moving forward with her life. The audacity was breathtaking. She forgave me, as if I was the one who needed forgiveness for not letting them steal my inheritance. I threw the letter away without responding. 2 years later, my accounting practice was thriving. I'd used Grandpa's money wisely, investing most of it while using a small portion to build a successful business. I bought a nice house in a different part of town and started dating someone who knew nothing about my family drama. That's when Mom showed up at my office. She looked older, more tired than I remembered. She said she missed me, that the family wasn't the same without me, that enough time had passed for everyone to move on. She asked if we could try to repair our relationship. I asked her if she was ready to apologize for what they did that night. She got defensive, saying they'd all been emotional and made mistakes, but that I'd made mistakes too by being stubborn and unforgiving. She suggested we could all just put the past behind us and focus on being a family again. I realized then that she still didn't understand what they'd done wrong. In her mind, the problem wasn't that they'd physically restrained me and destroyed my inheritance. It was that I'd refused to share money that was rightfully mine. She wanted reconciliation on her terms, with no real accountability for their actions. I told her the same thing I'd told Sarah. They'd made their choice that night when they held me down. They'd shown me exactly who they were when they thought they could bully me into submission. The money was just the catalyst. The real issue was that they'd been willing to assault and rob their own son when he didn't do what they wanted. Mom started crying, saying I was being cruel. That family should mean more than holding grudges. She said Sarah was struggling with her loans and could really use help, that Dad's business was failing and they might lose the house. She implied that I had a moral obligation to help them because I could afford it. I reminded her that she'd had a moral obligation not to physically attack her son, but that hadn't stopped her. I told her to leave and not come back. Final update. It's been 3 years now since Grandpa's death. I'm engaged to a wonderful woman who knows the whole story and supports my decision completely. My accounting practice has expanded to 3 employees, and I've bought 2 rental properties as investments. Grandpa would be proud of how I've grown his legacy. I still think about my family sometimes, especially during holidays. But then I remember that night. The feeling of helplessness as they held me down, the sound of paper tearing as Mom destroyed my future, the cold satisfaction in their eyes as they tried to steal what Grandpa had left me. They've tried reaching out a few more times through intermediaries. A family friend mentioned that Dad's business went under last year and they lost the house. Sarah finished medical school, but is drowning in debt. Uncle Mike apparently asked around about whether I might be willing to help with some medical bills. The answer is still no. Some people might think I'm cruel for not helping family members who are struggling financially. But they're not my family anymore. They made that clear the night they chose to see me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a son and brother to respect. Grandpa left me that money because he saw something in me that they never did. He believed I'd use it wisely and build something meaningful with my life. Every success I've had since then proves he made the right choice. They taught me the most valuable lesson of my life that night. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the quickest to betray you when something they want is at stake. I learned to value people who respect my boundaries over people who share my DNA. I sleep well at night knowing I protected what Grandpa built and used it to create the life he wanted for me. That's worth more than any relationship built on the expectation that I should sacrifice my future for people who were willing to assault me over money. They made their choice. Now they live with it.